Awoo! Hello everyone and welcome to day 13 of Terrorthon, a brief history of werewolves. We have already covered zombies and vampires in previous years, but now it's time to turn to more hairy monsters. So for those who don't know, a werewolf is a man or woman who morphs into a vicious wolf, usually under the light of a full moon. And you may be wondering where all this originates from. Well, I'll tell you. The werewolf made its debut in the poem The Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written on 1200 BC at earliest. This is the oldest known Western literature to reference a werewolf. In it, Gilgamesh jilts a potential lover who turned her previous lover into a wolf. And then we had the legend of Lycaon, where the son of Pelasgus angered Zeus by serving him the meal of a sacrificed boy, and Zeus turns Lycaon and his sons into wolves as punishment. This is where the term lycanthropy comes from. And then we also had in Nordic folklore the saga of the Volsungs, wherein a father and son discover pelts that turn people into wolves for 10 days. They then go on a killing spree in the forest before the father attacks his son, who is only saved when a raven gives the father a leaf with healing powers. Historically, a lot of serial killers were mistaken for werewolves, such as in 1521 we had Pierre Bourgault and Michel Verdun, who apparently swore allegiance to the devil and claimed to have an ointment that turned them into wolves. They brutally murdered several children before they were burned at the stake, which back then was thought to be the only way to kill a werewolf. And then we had Gilles Garnier, also known as the Werewolf of Dole, who apparently used the same ointment and also brutally murdered several children before being burned at the stake. It's never been conclusively proven if these people were mentally ill, if they were under hallucinogenics, or if they were just plain psychopaths. And we also had Peter Stubb of Bedburg in Germany, who ate citizens after killing them, and then he was tortured into his confession, claiming that he owned a magic belt that turned him into a werewolf. We can assume that the link between people turning into werewolves and the full moon can be traced back to lunatics, where certain people would go completely insane under a full moon, would turn very violent and attack people. But it could also be something simpler. Take for instance Peter the Wild Boy, who was discovered in 1725 wandering naked on all fours in a German forest. He was then adopted by the courts of Kings George I and II, and historians have concluded that he possibly had Pitt-Hopkins syndrome, which causes a lack of speech, seizures, and causes the victims to be intellectually challenged. But what about the history of werewolves in movies? Well, that goes back even further than you might imagine with the film The Werewolf, which was released in 1913, but is unfortunately lost today after a fire. And then in 1935, before The Wolfman, Universal attempted a werewolf movie simply called The Werewolf of London, before, of course, in 1941, The Wolfman came out, one of the classic Universal monsters played by Lon Chaney Jr. I believe this was the first werewolf movie to feature a transformation sequence, and of course it had several sequels like all of the Universal monster movies. Then in 1957, bringing the werewolf to a whole new audience, we had I Was a Teenage Werewolf, one of the most famous movie titles in history, I would say. And then Hammer had a go at it with Curse of the Werewolf in 1961, so they didn't just remake The Mummy, Frankenstein and Dracula, they did have a go at the werewolf movies too. And then, in 1981 we had possibly the most famous werewolf movie of all, An American Werewolf in London, bringing the hairy beast to the mainstream once again. That same year we also got The Howling, and these films were the first ones to explore the possible link to lycanthropy through repressed sexual desires. Then in 2000 we had a female werewolf movie with Ginger Snaps, and then in 2002 Neil Marshall directed a horror comedy called Dog Soldiers, and then somehow we ended up with the Twilight Werewolves, but we're not going to get into that now or ever. And there you go, a brief history of werewolves. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you tomorrow.